Imagine having so much money that you could pay off the debt of an entire country and still wake up richer than you were the day before. Imagine controlling the fuel that every train, every factory, and every lamp in America needed to survive. It sounds like a fantasy. It sounds like the kind of power no single family could ever hold. But one family did hold it. And they did it in a single lifetime. Starting with a quiet boy who kept his coins in a small book and counted every single penny he ever earned. This is the story of how the Rockefellers became the richest family in history and how their fortune grew so large that the American government itself had to step in to try and stop them. To understand the Rockefellers, you have to start with a man named John Davison Rockefeller. He was not born into money. He was born into uncertainty. His father was a traveling salesman who often disappeared for long stretches, a man who sold questionable medicines and lived a double life that the family did not fully understand until much later. His mother was deeply religious, careful, and strict about every coin that entered the house. Young John absorbed both sides. From his father he learned how to negotiate and how to never show his full hand. From his mother, he learned discipline, patience, and the habit of saving. By the time he was a teenager, he was already keeping a small ledger where he recorded every cent he received and every cent he spent. That little book was the seed of everything that came later. At 16, John got his first real job as an assistant bookkeeper for a small trading firm. The pay was tiny, but he treated the work as if the fate of the world depended on it. He loved numbers. He loved the quiet certainty of a column that added up correctly. While other young men his age spent their evenings having fun, John studied the flow of money in and out of businesses, learning how goods moved, how prices were set, and where the hidden profits were. He was not the loudest person in the room, and he was not the most charming, but he understood something that most people around him did not. He understood that money follows systems, and whoever controls the system controls the money. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the late 1850s, a strange black liquid was pulled out of the ground in Pennsylvania, and suddenly, the world went a little bit mad. Oil. At first, nobody was completely sure what to do with it, but very quickly people realized it could be refined into kerosene, and kerosene could light homes far more cheaply than the old whale oil that had lit lamps for generations. A gold rush began, except this time it was a black rush. Thousands of people raced to drill wells, hoping to strike it rich overnight. Most of them failed. And here is where John Rockefeller did something clever. Something that would define his entire life. He looked at the chaos of the oil fields, the drilling, the gambling, the wild ups and downs, and he decided he wanted no part of the risky drilling. Instead, he would control the part of the business that nobody could avoid. He would control the refining. Think about it this way. Everyone was fighting to pull oil out of the ground, but that oil was useless to a normal family until it was refined into kerosene. If John controlled the refineries, then it did not matter who won the drilling war. Every barrel of oil, no matter who found it, would eventually have to pass through his hands to become something people could actually buy. So in 1863, he opened his first refinery in Cleveland. And this is where the story stops being about a clever young man and starts becoming the story of an empire. John was obsessed with efficiency in a way that bordered on the extreme. Most refiners were wasteful. They threw away the byproducts of refining because they only cared about the kerosene. John refused to waste anything. He found ways to sell the leftover materials as lubricants, as paraffin for candles, as petroleum jelly, as fuel, as tar for roads. While his competitors were throwing money into the river, he was turning their trash into profit. He even built his own barrels because buying them from others was too expensive. He owned the forests that grew the wood, the kilns that dried it, and the wagons that carried it. Every step of the process that he could control, he controlled. And every step he controlled, he made cheaper than anyone else could. By 1870, he took all of this obsession and turned it into a single company with a name that would soon terrify every competitor in America. Standard Oil. The name itself was a promise. In a market full of unreliable, inconsistent kerosene that sometimes exploded in people's homes, Standard Oil promised a product that was always the same, always safe, always standard. Customers trusted it. And that trust, combined with his ruthless efficiency, gave him a weapon that his rivals simply could not match. He could sell kerosene cheaper than anyone and still make a healthy profit, because his costs were lower at every single stage. But John did not want to just win. He wanted to win completely. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. He began approaching his competitors, the smaller refineries all around him, and he made them an offer. Sell your company to me, join Standard Oil, and become a shareholder in something much bigger. To many, it sounded generous. To others, it sounded like a threat, because everyone understood the unspoken second half of the sentence. Sell to me, or I will use my lower costs to sell kerosene cheaper than you can afford, until you have nothing left. One by one, the refineries fell. Some joined willingly and grew wealthy alongside him. Others resisted, fought, and were slowly crushed by prices they could not survive. People later called this period the Cleveland Massacre. Because in a matter of weeks, Standard Oil swallowed nearly every refinery in the city. Now here is where it gets truly interesting, because John understood a secret that gave him an even greater advantage. The oil could not sell itself unless it could travel. And in that era, oil traveled by railroad. So John went to the railroad companies and used the sheer size of Standard Oil as leverage. He told them, I will guarantee you a massive, steady stream of shipments every single day, more than any other customer you have. But in return, you must give me a secret discount that my competitors do not get. The railroads, desperate for his reliable business, agreed. This meant that not only was Standard Oil cheaper to produce, it was also cheaper to ship. His competitors were being beaten twice over, and many of them did not even understand how it was happening. They just knew that somehow, no matter what they did, they could never quite catch up. As the 1870s rolled on, Standard Oil grew into something the world had never seen before. It did not just control refining. It reached backward to control the barrels, the pipelines, the storage tanks, and forward to control the distribution, the marketing, the wagons that delivered kerosene to towns across the country. It became what people call a vertical monopoly, meaning it controlled nearly every single step from the raw oil to the lamp burning in a family's living room. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of all the oil refining in the United States. 90%. That is not a company competing in a market. That is a company that has become the market. To manage something this enormous, John and his lawyers invented a brand new way of organizing a business. They created something called a trust. Instead of a messy collection of separate companies, the trust allowed a small group of men at the top to control dozens of businesses all at once, as if they were a single giant organism. This structure was so powerful and so new that the word trust became a symbol of enormous corporate power, and later, the laws written to break up monopolies would be called antitrust laws, named directly after what Standard Oil had built. John had not just built a company, he had invented a new shape of power itself. The money that flowed in was almost impossible to comprehend. At his peak, John Rockefeller was worth so much that historians estimate his fortune, adjusted for the size of the economy in his time, would make him richer than any modern billionaire alive today. He was America's first true billionaire. in an age when a single dollar could feed a family for days. His wealth was not just large, it was a force of nature. It shaped politics, it shaped cities, it shaped the daily life of millions of ordinary people who lit their homes every night with his kerosene without ever knowing his name. But such power could not go unnoticed forever. As Standard Oil grew, so did the anger against it. Small business owners who had been crushed told their stories. Journalists began investigating the secret deals, the railroad discounts, the quiet threats. One writer in particular, a woman named Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined in the oil wars, spent years digging into Standard Oil and published a detailed account of exactly how the empire had been built. The public, which had once simply enjoyed cheap kerosene, began to see the machine behind the curtain, and many of them did not like what they saw. The idea that one family could control something so essential to daily life started to feel less like success and more like a threat to fairness itself. The pressure built for years, until finally the government acted. In 1911, the highest court in the United States made a historic decision. Standard Oil was ruled to be an illegal monopoly, and it was ordered to be broken apart into many smaller, separate companies. On paper, this looked like the end of the Rockefeller empire. The giant was being shattered into pieces. But here is the twist that almost nobody expected. John Rockefeller owned large shares in every single one of those new companies. And as those separate pieces began to compete and grow on their own, their combined value soared even higher than the single company had been worth. The breakup that was meant to reduce his power actually made him even richer. Some of those pieces are still giant oil companies whose names you would recognize today. By this point in his life, John had already stepped back from the daily running of the business, and he turned his attention to something that would shape his legacy just as much as the oil. He began giving his money away, but in a careful, systematic way, the same way he had once counted every penny in his little book. He funded universities. He funded medical research that helped wipe out deadly diseases. He funded public health programs that saved countless lives around the world. He believed that wealth carried a responsibility, and he poured enormous sums into institutions that still exist and still do good work more than a century later. The same relentless mind that had crushed competitors now organized charity on a scale the world had never seen. And this is the real secret of how the Rockefellers stayed rich, not just for one generation, but for many. John understood that a fortune built by one person can easily be destroyed by the next generation who did not have to fight for it. So he did not simply hand piles of cash to his children. He built structures. He created trusts and foundations and careful systems designed to protect the wealth, to grow it slowly, and to pass it down through generations without being wasted. His son, John Jr., devoted much of his life to managing and protecting the family name and fortune, funding enormous projects, and guarding the legacy. The family spread its wealth into banking, into real estate, into countless investments far beyond oil. Generations later, the Rockefeller name still carries weight. There have been governors, bankers, and philanthropists. There are famous buildings and centers that bear the family name in the heart of great cities. The original mountain of oil money was transformed, over decades, into a diversified, protected, and enduring dynasty. And it all traces back to a quiet, disciplined boy who kept a little book of every coin he ever earned, who looked at a chaotic gold rush and decided he would not gamble on finding oil, but would instead control the one narrow point that all the oil had to pass through. That is the lesson buried inside this entire story. John Rockefeller did not become the richest man in history by working harder than everyone else. Though he did work hard, he did not do it by taking wild risks, because in fact he avoided the biggest risk of all, the drilling. He did it by understanding systems, by finding the one part of the machine that everyone else was forced to depend on, and by controlling that part completely and ruthlessly. He turned oil from a chaotic gamble into a predictable, controlled empire. And in doing so, he wrote the blueprint that ambitious families and companies have studied ever since. The Rockefellers show us something both inspiring and unsettling about how great fortunes are truly built. They are rarely built by luck alone. They are built by discipline, by patience, by control, and sometimes by a willingness to do things that others were not willing to do. And once such a fortune is built, the true genius is not in spending it, but in protecting it, structuring it, and passing it down so carefully that a single lifetime of ambition becomes a legacy that lasts for 100 years and beyond. From a small ledger book to the richest empire the world had ever seen, the story of the Rockefellers is the story of how old money is really made.